All right, today we are diving into a source that presents a really unique and, I have to say, pretty radical reinterpretation of some key Quranic terms. It suggests a completely different way of looking at what they might mean.
So let's just jump right in with the central question this whole analysis is built on. What if, when we read certain scriptural references, we're not talking about a religion or an ethnicity at all? What if we're actually talking about a specific methodology, a way of thinking that anyone, literally anyone, could adopt?
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get into what the source actually means by a methodology. Then, we'll look at the specific traits it says are part of this Jewish millah. After that, we'll tackle three really important, similar-sounding terms, dig into their linguistic roots, and then finally, we'll see why the source argues this is a warning for all of us. Okay, so let's start with the absolute core idea here. The source argues that before we can get anywhere, we have to draw a clear line between the idea of a faith and something it calls a millah. And that word, millah, is the key to everything. According to this source, it doesn't mean religion like we usually think of it. Nope. It refers to your personal method for seeking and verifying truth. Think of it like your own internal operating system for knowledge. It's a framework, not a label you're born with. So if a millah is a method, what exactly are the traits of this specific Jewish millah the source is talking about? Well, the argument is that Scripture itself lays out a very clear pattern of thought and behavior. The analysis really kicks off with verses like this one. The source zooms in on that statement, "We are the children of God and His beloved," and says, see, that's the first key characteristic of this mindset, a kind of self-praise and a claim to being special. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because the source lays out a whole progression, like a domino effect. It starts with that self-praise, right? That then leads to accusing anyone who disagrees with you of being baseless, on nothing. From there, it moves to exclusion, believing you're the only one with the truth. And that in turn escalates to actual hostility and enmity, which, the source claims, ultimately leads to causing real-world corruption. And this verse is presented as evidence of that final stage. The argument is that this striving to cause corruption is the end point of that methodology, and it links directly back to that very first step of claiming to be special. So to boil it all down, the source says the core traits of this methodology are rejecting any truth that goes against what you want to believe, an active conscious denial of evidence called juhud, and hiding the truth. And what's the fuel for this whole engine? According to this analysis, it's arrogance, or kib. Okay, this next part is absolutely critical to the whole argument. The source claims that the Quran makes a super precise distinction between three different terms that often get lumped together. Understanding the difference, it says, changes everything. So just look at this table for a second. The source lays out a really important distinction. First, you have al-Yahud. It says this is a group that formed centuries after Moses, and they're the ones who originated this millah, this methodology. Then you have al-Latina Hadu, which it says were the original followers of Moses. And finally, you have Hud, a specific subset of those original followers. Getting these three straight is essential to the whole theory. So, to put it even more simply, the source is drawing a very sharp line in the sand. On one side, you've got al-Latina Hadu, the people who actually received the message from the prophet Moses. And on the other, you have al-Yahud, a group that the source argues popped up way later and is defined not by who their ancestors were, but by the fact that they adopted this specific methodology of thinking. So, you might be asking, okay, where's the proof for this distinction? Well, the source turns to linguistics. It argues that the very root of the word Yahud gives away its true meaning as a methodology. The root verb is hada, and according to this interpretation, it doesn't just mean to be Jewish. It describes an action of wavering, of hesitating, of circling around a point, but with the clear intention of never actually moving past it. You know? It suggests a kind of evasive, closed-minded dance around an idea. The source then points us to this verse. Here, Moses is speaking for his followers after they'd gone astray, and he uses the word hudna. Now, the context is about returning to God, but the specific word choice here is, according to the source, incredibly significant. So here's the linguistic breakdown. Hudna describes something that happened in the past, a hesitant return to God. This, the source says, defines the al-Latina Hadal, the ones who made that hesitant return. But then it contrasts this with the word Yahud, which is presented as the active, continuous form of that verb. So a Yahud
is someone who is currently and constantly wavering, someone whose whole approach is evasive.
So, what's the point of all this? Why does it even matter? Well, the source concludes by arguing that this isn't just some historical debate. It's actually a universal warning for everybody about the danger of using a flawed method to search for truth.
And this verse is held up as the final piece of evidence. The source points out that the verse doesn't say until you follow their religion. It says until you follow their mila, their methodology. This, it argues, reframes the entire discussion. It's not about competing faiths. It's about competing frameworks for thinking.
And that brings us to the big takeaway. According to this analysis, a mila has nothing to do with your religion or your background. It means anyone, from any faith, can fall into the trap of adopting a Jewish mila of arrogance and exclusion. The source even warns that these mindsets have crept into all communities and says the real goal is to follow the mila of Abraham, an approach described as open, sincere, and truth-seeking.
So, to wrap it all up in one final definition, the Jewish Malacha, according to this source, is not a religion. It is a methodology for processing the world, one that is built on rejecting any evidence that challenges what you already believe, and one that moves from self-praise all the way to hostility towards anyone who disagrees.
And that leaves us with a pretty deep question to ponder. The entire argument we've just explored hinges on the importance of methodology. So it really makes you think, doesn't it? To what extent does the way we look for truth end up defining the very truth we find?